Right guys, today we're doing a 1UZ non-VVTi, and this is using either a Link Atom or a Monsoon, and it is a completely brand new harness with a fully modular design. So let's get into it. Right, so as I said, this is a completely brand new harness for a 1UZ non-VVTi. It is designed to run either a Link Atom or a Link Monsoon, so you can use either ECU and interchange them, no problem. Running a manual gearbox, obviously, because the ECU is unable to control an automatic transmission on its own. So in this particular case, what we're going to do today is, first of all, we're going to go through the layout of the entire harness so the customer knows exactly where everything goes. Then we're going to go into the testing, which is obviously with just the ignition on and also with the engine running itself. So before we jump into the layout, as you can see, there's a completely brand new harness here. So what we're going to do, cut to the build photo so you guys can see what it takes and what is made up building this harness, and a couple of the sub harnesses the customer has opted for here. So let's do that now and be back in a second. Right, so now you've seen all of that, let's jump into the layout of the harness. So it's quite a simple harness because obviously it's only designed for an Atom or a Monsoon. So we'll start here at the ECU end and work our way across to the engine harness, and we'll go through all of the modular sections that are available with this particular harness. So ECU wise, obviously just one plug that's going into the ECU, nice and simple. You then have a map sensor input. This is on the Monsoon. The Atom does not have that. You then have your USB insert over there. So again, very nice, small, basic ECU. Obviously, these are only capable of running up to a 4-cylinder fully sequential. So in our particular case, we are running semi-sequential injection and wasted spark ignition for this. Right. Coming out of this section over here, we then have our fuse box plug. So that is supplying all the powers into the harness itself. Then coming out of this side over here, we have another fuse box plug, and that is going over there, and that is things from the ECU that need to go to the fuse box itself. Right, and these two plugs are completely unique. You can't get them mixed up, so you don't have to worry about that at all. Lastly, coming out of that section over there, we do have our CAN plug. So obviously these ECUs are capable of running CAN devices. So we have allocated that, and we have included both a power and a ground for that particular setup. Moving along, we've got our grommet, which is slid down over here, but obviously this is meant to slide all the way along the harness wherever the customer requires it. And once he does that, he then has a piece of SCL, epoxy lined heat shrink, which he can then seal up, and then that will make that waterproof from the outside once it's fitted into the vehicle. Moving our way up from there, we then get to our molded T-piece boot over here. And obviously the harness is going to split off that way, and it's going to go that way. First thing we're going to do is go this way, come back, and then we're going to start with everything that's popping out the side over here. So moving along here, it's pretty simple. Obviously the injectors are on their own sub harness, so it's basically just moving along till it splits up at the front here, and then it goes to the cam sensor over there. So do bear in mind that although we are running wasted spark ignition and semi-sequential injection, the crank sensor, standard crank sensor on a 1UZ non-VVTi is a 12 tooth with no missing. So you would still need a cam signal to do that. Now you can opt to run the VVTi trigger, which is a 36-2 trigger wheel, and that would allow you to run just a crank sensor with this particular setup on this V8, because again, we are running semi-sequential injection and wasted spark. Therefore, we only need a timing mark on the crank. But in this case, because we're running a standard crank trigger, we've got 12 with no missing teeth, so we are using the cam sensor on this particular case. Moving along down to here, and it's going to split up at the top here, and there's only 2 breakouts over here. The first one is going to go down through there, down to there, and that is your crank sensor over there. Again, everything is fully labeled for you guys, so it's really, really easy to install. The other section that breaks out from there is going to be your oil plug. Now, because of the limited inputs and outputs, we don't have one where you can put oil pressure and temperature. So this one is only capable of running either an oil pressure switch for a light that you can use a wire that we provide you at the fuse box, or in the case of the customer's opted for, he's just running a 150 psi pressure sensor for his oil. Okay, that obviously does unplug, so he could add a pressure switch if he wanted to as well, but he has opted for the oil pressure sensor on its own. Right, so that is that section over there. So what we're going to do now is pop back over here and let's start looking at what pops out over here. I'm going to start with the things that go down. So first of all, over here we've got our ground. So again, that just bolts directly onto there. It's an M8 bolt, and I advise against putting it in these 2 lower holes because the holes are actually quite big and our ring terminal actually gets sunken into these 2 holes. So please use the top hole on there, not the 2 bottom ones. Next up, popping out of here is going to be our ignition left harness, and again that goes all the way to the Audi coils that the customer has opted for. So again, you can completely disconnect that. The customer could change the Denso coils, he could change the Nissan R35 coils, whatever he wants. He can phone us up and we can make him a separate sub harness, and that tucks away nice and neatly at the back there so you don't see it. Next up, coming out of there is going to be our sub harness. So this is the one that goes underneath and to the knock sensors and the starter motor. So I'm going to cut to a picture now so you can see that. So you can see it goes straight in, starter motor, knock sensor, brilliant. Okay, right, so coming back over here, we then have the 2 sections that pop out over here. One is going to be the injectors. So again, all of the 8 injectors are on their own separate sub harness. Now in this case, the customer is using what we call EV1 style injector plug. So you can see I've made a little adapters to the standard 1UZ non-VVTi injectors. So again, this is the purpose of the sub harness. The customer, if you wanted to change over to Denso injectors or USCAR, which is obviously like IDs, etc., then he can just phone us up and we can make him a new injector harness, and he can unplug this one, plug in the new one, change injectors, no problem. Doesn't need to replace the entire harness or make any sort of adaptation to it. Next up is your throttle plug. Okay, so in this case, this is going underneath here, along with the injectors. So actually, I'm going to cut some photos now so you can see all of this. So it goes in, all the injectors obviously split out and go separate their ways. So you've got your left bank and you've got your right bank. The throttle harness goes all the way across, all the way down, comes out the middle, and then it goes to the TPS plug and comes out the front, and then it goes to the idle speed control valve. Okay, right, so back in the room again. Right, so as you can see, due to the lack of inputs and or specifically outputs in this case, you cannot run the standard 1UZ non-VVTi idle speed control valve because that requires 4 wires or 4 outputs. All right, so what's happening in this particular case is obviously there's a couple of options available to you guys. And what we have done is we've put the ability to put up to a 3-wire idle speed control valve in there. In this particular case, the customer is using a Bosch VW Bosch VW idle speed control valve. It's only a 2-wire idle speed control valve, so that is then part of the throttle harness over there. So again, if he was to change his throttle body for whatever reason, or he was to change his idle speed control valve for whatever reason, he would only need to buy just the little sub harness attached to the throttle over there. Okay, this is obviously not how it's going to be fitted on his car. I actually have a picture for from the guy who's installing it of another vehicle that he's used with this particular idle speed control valve, and I'm going to put it up there now so you can see it. So yeah, so it's quite a nice little fitting with just the pipe coming out there, and that's sort of going straight onto there, leaning out there with the plug going into it like that. So it's quite a nice little neat setup when you look at it that way. Okay, right, so that is pretty much everything over here. So we've got grounds, ignition, sub harness to underneath, throttle and injectors. So let's move over to that side over there, and then we'll start going through there. Right, so when we get down here, we've obviously got a little mounting point there if you want to use a P-clamp or whatever. We've got a couple of things coming out here. So first of all, we have got our ignition for the right bank. So again, that plugs in there and can tuck away nice and neatly inside there to be kept out of the way of everybody who can see it. Next up, we've got a couple of little add-ons. Now, in the case of the Atom, obviously there is no built-in map sensor. So what we have done over here is we have put the map sensor, and we put a plug that can go directly into a link map sensor. So if you were using this with an Atom, this would obviously be populated with a map sensor, okay? If the customer decides he doesn't want to use a map sensor that's built into the ECU, he can also then opt to use a map sensor that's in here as well. And then lastly, we have ability to add a fuel pressure sensor, okay? Now, obviously there are limitations between the Atom and the Monsoon, but we'll go through that when we go through all of the paperwork, okay? Right, so moving along there, we're going to pop along down through there, underneath the intake over there, remembering that the TPS actually forms part of its own harness that goes through there. Pop along back through here, and then it's going to split up at the front here, and we've got a couple of things coming off. First of all, we've got the coolant temperature sensor. This is for the ECU itself. We then have added a wire for a temperature sensor, so if you guys wanted to fit like an aftermarket temperature sensor, you can then use one of the wires we have at the fuse box to do that. So that's that one. Then we also have the intake air temperature sensor. So that plugs in there. So again, you can alter the length. You can have different sensors. You can change it out whenever you want. But in this case, we're using a Bosch fast response IAT sensor, and he can mount that anywhere in his intake that he wants. Okay, so that's going to go over there. Right, then lastly, popping down over here, we've then got our alternator plug. So again, as per usual with all of our harnesses, these are on a sub harness. So you are able to swap these out. So if you get a different alternator with a different plug, or if you guys are stuck with space and you need to mount the alternator on the other side, again, it's nice and easy. We can literally make your harness that goes all the way down along the subframe up the other side and plugs in over there. So again, that's a nice feature of these modular harnesses. You can chop and change and do whatever you like. All right, so that is the complete layout. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to get all the paperwork ready, because obviously with these aftermarket ECUs, there are quite a bit of things to go through with the paperwork. So we are going to do that, and I'm going to get it all printed out, come back, and we'll go through all of that. So see you in a second. Right guys, so now we're back and we're going to go through the paperwork and the connector that the customers have to connect inside their vehicle. So the connector I'm speaking of is just the 9-pin one over here. If you've seen any of our other videos, pretty much a standard across all of our harnesses now. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go through the 9-pin plug, going to go through all 9 wires. It is all included in the welcome pack that the customers do get with the harness as well. So to start off with, we've got pin number 1, and that is your red 14 gauge wire. Now this is supplying power to pretty much everything in the fuse box, including the starter motor and all of that type of jazz. Starter motor solenoid, sorry, I'll say that. Now, in this case, I know I normally leave a generic thing saying connected to a permanent 12 volt source. But with the Link Monsoon and that, you do not need to connect it to a permanent 12 volt source. All right, there's no reason for this ECU to have a permanent 12 volts. Next up is number 2, and that's going to be black with a yellow tracer. Now, as I said, with all of our Link ECUs, the starter is actually controlled via the ECU. So in this case, you can either connect a 12 volts or a ground to it. You just have to set up in the ECU correctly, okay? I've done a whole video on starter control, so I'll put a link up in the top there for you guys. So basically, I've set it up currently to work with 12 volts because that's more than likely what you guys are going to come across. You're going to use a key, barrel, or something like that in order to start it. Boom, you're going to get 12 volts. If you're going to fit like a start button, then there's no need to run 12 volts through that start button. You can actually run a ground. You just need to tell the ECU that the starter input switch is a ground rather than 12 volts. We do fuse it in our fuse box. So again, wherever the source is coming from, it's obviously not capable of shorting the ECU. The fuse will blow before that happens. Next up is number 3, and that's going to be the yellow with the green wire that you can see is connected to my little device there. So we can get the coolant temperature up on the gauge in a minute when we start it up. And that again is connected to that little single wire that we have over there. So again, it's not necessary to use that, but if you want to put your own temperature sensor in this particular spot over here on the water bridge, and then you can come along and it's going to come out of that yellow with the green one over there, so you can run a temperature gauge on your dash. Okay. Then number 4 is your gray, and that is a 16 gauge wire, and that is your fuel pump. So again, it's relayed inside the fuse box, so that you can take literally directly to your fuel pump. It does have a 20 amp fuse attached to it. But if you require more power, then obviously you can just use that gray output to trigger a relay at the back of the vehicle where you can run whatever pumps you need to run. Next up is going to be number 5, and that's going to be yellow with a red tracer. And again, it's connected to my dash cluster over here. And so we put the ignition on, we can actually see the check engine light. We also have a check engine light in the fuse box over there as well. Next up is number 6, and that is a solid yellow wire, and that again is plugged into my cluster here. So we're going to be able to see the rev counter, because the yellow is the tacho wire. So that's going to output a tachometer or rev counter signal for you guys. Then we have pin number 7, and that is a red with a black, and that is your ignition 12 volts. That's what's going to turn the system on, okay? That does need to be at 12 volts. And if you are using a key barrel, I say it every time, but do be careful. On key barrels, you have accessory and you have ignition, two completely separate things. Easy way to find it is find the 12 volts at the back of your ignition barrel, but then move the key to the start position and make sure the 12 volts stays there. If the 12 volt disappears when you move the key to the start position, what you've got there is accessory feed, not ignition feed. That is important because obviously if you then move the key to the start position and you use that as your ignition input, effectively as soon as you move the key to the start position, it's going to cut the 12 volts, going to kill the ECU and all of that. So that's going to mean your engine's not going to start. Okay. Next up is number 8, and that is a pink with a blue, and that is going to be an alternator light. And again, that one is going to be connected to our orange box over there to be able to display on the cluster over there when we turn the ignition on. Lastly, we've got number 9, and that is yellow with a black, and that is oil pressure. Now, in this particular case, the customer doesn't have an oil pressure switch connected. He's just opted for the oil pressure sensor. So he's going to control the safeties in terms of oil pressure through his ECU itself, okay? Now, you can obviously opt for that, and if you do opt for the oil pressure switch, either with an oil pressure sensor or just on its own, then obviously that will then come out on the yellow with the black one. I'm going to go through the differences between the Monsoon and the Atom in a minute, because we do actually take also that switch to the ECU, but only in the Monsoon. So therefore, if you can run safeties in the ECU. So if your oil light came on, it would obviously shut the ECU down to try and save your engine. Okay. Right, so that is all the 9 wires in there. Then underneath that, I've got the CAN pinout. Now, it is just the standard link CAN pinout. Okay, so you've got 1 is 12 volts, 2 is ground, 3 is CAN low, 4 is CAN high, okay? Obviously the CAN wires are twisted together in this small section over here. There is no terminating resistor in there. Obviously there's only one CAN bus on here. So whatever you connect to the other end, either make sure that you do have the ability to turn on a terminating resistor, or if you do need to fit one, make sure you do fit one after the plug itself over there. Okay, I didn't want to fit one in there to limit you guys because there is one built into the ECU. You just need to terminate the other side with a 120 ohm resistor. Okay. Right, so let's get on to what are the differences depending on what ECU you go with. So I've got the entire ECU pinout over there. There's the Monsoon, which uses literally every single pin on the 34 pin plug. And over here, I've got the Atom, and you can see there's a couple of grayed out areas over here, okay? And I have listed down over here what will not work if you have an Atom and what will work if you, also what will not work if you use an Atom ECU. So I'm gonna go through those now quickly. Right, number 1 is knock control. So knock control is only present on the Monsoon and not on the Atom, okay? Now then, there is only one knock input, and you say, but Chris, you've got 2 knock sensors on this engine. How does that work? Well, it's not a problem because the G4X has the ability to do window knock. So basically what that means, okay, is because we're using a cam and a crank sensor, technically the ECU knows exactly which cylinder should be firing. In other words, it's capable of running a 4-cylinder fully sequential, but because it knows both the cam and the crank position, it knows exactly which cylinder is firing, and therefore, even though we have 2 knock sensors on one input, if it detects knock, the ECU knows exactly which cylinder is actually on its power stroke, if you will, on its where it's actually sparked and the piston's going back down again. So it knows exactly which cylinder is knocking. Okay, so that's how you can use 2 knock sensors with 1 input, just because you have that ability to window, and everyone, the ECU will know exactly what it is. But there is a caveat to that, and obviously we've done it with the cam sensor and the crank sensor, but if you guys are using a Monsoon and you don't put a cam sensor because you decided to go with the 36-2 trigger wheel on the crank, then clearly the ECU is not going to know which cylinder should be at its power stroke. So you do need to bear that in mind if you are undertaking this with the Monsoon and you do want to have knock control and you do want to use 2 knock sensors. If that's the case, you must use the cam sensor and the crank sensor, even if you change the crank trigger wheel to the 36-2 VVTi wheel. Okay. Next up is fuel pressure. Unfortunately, on the Atom, you're not able to add a fuel pressure sensor. So that fuel pressure sensor plug would become completely redundant in the event that you used an Atom. Number 3, as I said, the oil pressure switch input. So that is digital input 3. I've allocated that to be a oil pressure switch input in case you don't opt for the oil pressure sensor. So if you have an Atom, that one falls away because digital input 3 falls away. Next up, number 4, you will not be able to use a 3-wire idle control valve if you have the Atom, only if you have the Monsoon. Okay, so do bear that in mind as well. And then lastly, the check engine light. Okay, so the check engine light will fall away if you have an Atom, but not if you have a Monsoon. Okay, so those are basically the 5 differences between using an Atom ECU on this harness versus using a Monsoon ECU on this harness. Okay, but do remember, even though you use the Monsoon, the map plug that I have put on there, still capable of being used, obviously both the Atom and the Monsoon, because obviously the Atom does not have a built-in map sensor. Okay, so on the actual Monsoon, technically that map sensor, if you don't use it as a map sensor, it's technically an analog input. So you could use any 0 to 5 volt sensor in place of that map plug over there. So that is available to you in that particular case. On the Atom, obviously that would be used for the map sensor. Okay. Right, so hopefully that is nice and simple and straightforward. Obviously, like I said, because I built this harness to work for both the Monsoon and an Atom, I wanted to go through the differences between the two of them. In this case, we're going with a Monsoon, so basically everything on this harness that can work is working. And obviously, you can still add on a bunch of stuff over there, like the fuel pressure sensor as well, etc. Right, guys, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to go away, I'm going to fire everything up, get it, make sure it's all running. Then I'm going to pop back and I'm going to get all the testing paperwork out so we can start doing the testing. And again, made up of 2 sections, one with just the ignition on and one with the engine running. So bear with me a second and I'll be back. Right, guys, so now we're back and we're going to be doing the testing of the harness. And as I said before, made up of 2 sections, one with just the ignition on and one with the engine running. Now, with the aftermarket ECUs, there's a lot of setups and things that we go through. So at the end of this list, I'm going to put my link engine management playlist of all the different things, how to test all your inputs and outputs and so on and so forth. But it would make literally an 1.5 hour long video to go through every single thing. Now, obviously we do go through it on the harness before we send it to the customer, but what I'd rather do is let you go through those videos if you want to see how to test things like the oil pressure sensor, etc., etc. What we're going to do now basically is a kind of a very basic rundown of a test so you guys can see that everything works. So first thing we're going to be testing with just the ignition on is basically check engine light. Oil pressure light is not going to be applicable in this case because again the customer's opted for an oil pressure sensor, and the alternator light. So we're going to turn the ignition on and make sure that those particular things turn on. Then what we're going to do is we're going to jump into with the engine running. So I'm going to do it in one big go. And basically what I'm going to do is, starting with the starting circuits, I'm going to make sure that when I touch the black with the yellow tracer wire to 12 volts, that the ECU takes over and it'll turn over the engine until it fires up. Then we're going to come back to the cluster and we're going to look at the tacho to make sure that we're getting a tacho signal over there. Then I'm going to go around the engine and I'm going to pull out each injector one by one so we can hear them misfiring. So I know that every single cylinder is firing exactly as it should. And then we'll come back to here and we should be able to see the coolant temp sensor display on the cluster over there. Again, I'm just taking it to that little device that interprets it and sends it to the cluster over there, but it's to prove that that yellow with the green wire is actually connected and it does work. Right, so to put the ignition on, really super simple. I'm going to take my black with the red wire and I'm going to give it 12 volts. So let me do that. Give me a second. All right, so you can actually hear the priming of the fuel pump relay. So you heard the click over there and you heard the pump run in the background there. Now moving on to what we want to test, and that is our check engine light. So you can see it comes on there. Remember, this wouldn't be applicable on the Atom. We've also got the check engine light inside the fuse box, a little LED. So even before you connect that up, you can see whether your ECU is turning on. And then lastly, we've got our charge light or our battery light over there. Now, obviously, when this thing runs, we want to see the check engine light and the battery light turn off, just to prove that they are working, both the alternator and the ECU is not registering any faults. Right, so because it's so short, what I'm basically going to do now is I'm going to move straight into the running of the engine. So I've got my ear defenders here ready. So I'm going to put those on and then we'll get into that. So as I said, the starting is controlled by the ECU. So all I have to do is just literally touch this black with the yellow wire on 12 volts and she will start. So I will do that now. Rightio. So first of all, you see the battery light has gone out, check engine light has gone out. We've got a tacho signal coming through there. I'll give it a bit of a rev. Rightio. Okay, and you can actually see we've got the coolant temperature showing on the dash there as well, so we're super happy with that. But let's go to all the injectors now and make sure that they are firing as they should. So I'm going to start off this side over here. So this is going to be injector 7, injector 5, injector 3, and injector 1. Rightio, let's go over to the other side there. Let's start with this one, which is injector 2. I'm going to pop over here to injector 8. Go to injector 6. And let's pop over here to injector 4. Fantastic. Okay, right. So, as I said, the testing with the aftermarket ECUs is generally quite short. There are a lot of testing of inputs and outputs that does happen behind the scenes that I don't video. Again, it would be a very, very, very long video if I did that. But what I do have for you guys is the whole link playlist with everything in there. How to set up an ECU from scratch, setting up all your inputs, all your outputs, going through things like triggers, going through things like starter control, going through things like fuel pump control, all of that type of stuff. And obviously with aftermarket ECUs, you can start to get really deep into them and you can do a lot of things with them if you know what you're doing. So again, with aftermarket ECUs, guys, do feel free to fire us any question that you like. If we don't know the answer, we will get it for you. And then usually I tend to do those videos. I like you guys to ask me questions because then I get to do a video on it and explain it in detail. Okay, so again, thanks for watching, guys. We're going to get this harness off to the guy so he can have it installed in his vehicle and start enjoying his engine and his setup. So that's it for me. If you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them below. Again, if you are looking for this particular setup, just send us a message. We'll be able to get a quote out to you because now this is fully designed, so it's relatively straightforward. Just bearing in mind, when you guys are looking at these modular harnesses, just one thing to bear in mind is please watch one of these videos and I might send you a link to it so you get an idea of what is your option. So in other words, what items do you have to choose from? Okay, so things like coils, injectors, idle speed control, throttle, ignition, etc., etc. You're going to need to know exactly what you want with your setup if you want a quote. All right, so thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon. And again, like I said, if you have any questions, please feel asked below. So cheers, guys. See you later.
Break, always fight, never quit, do it right, play the game, win it life, have no shame, there's no time, feel the pain, live the grind, I could change, in my mind, pick a lane, commit and climb, the only way to win it life, I never miss, that's fact, taking big swings, put your hand to the bat, put me in the ring, you'll go out in a bag, cause I sing what I mean and I bring it to the mad light, ain't got time to kill, I got time to feel, I took the red pill, I know life's short so I wanna live real, but how's it supposed to